British soldier. All around the globe you'll find him, from Gibraltar to Hong Kong. Everywhere he stands against the threatening years, staunch symbol of our common will to order.
En los días del Imperio Británico, la City de Londres fue el mayor centro financiero del mundo.
The City of London was the kind of beating financial heart of the British Empire. The historians Kane and Hopkins call it the governor of the imperial engine. All these countries in the empire used to use the sterling currency, and the City of London was kind of the financier of this zone, not just inside the sterling zone, but outside the sterling zone as well.
Mientras el Imperio Británico decaía, también lo hacía la City de Londres.
One British army truck is bombed, killing 2 soldiers and wounding 12. As rioting becomes daily more widespread on Cyprus, young people of high school age take an increasing part in the violence. Here a group of girls are being dispersed after a rock-throwing battle with British military police.
Con el declive del imperio, los intereses comerciales británicos en todo el mundo se encontraban amenazados. En 1956, Egipto nacionalizó el Canal de Suez.
A new Middle East crisis arises as President Nasser of Egypt tells a wildly cheering crowd in Alexandria that Egypt has seized the internationally owned Suez Canal. France and Britain issue a 12-hour ultimatum. Within hours of its expiration, Britain's warplanes are winging their way to Egypt, and its bombers attack 5 key cities, including Cairo.
Los Estados Unidos se oponían a la invasión y presionaron a Gran Bretaña y Francia para que retiraran sus tropas.
There will be no United States involvement in these present hostilities. It is our hope and intent that this matter will be brought before the United Nations General Assembly. There, the opinion of the world can be brought to bear in our quest for a just end to this tormenting problem.
La Gran Bretaña fue humillada. La crisis del Suez significó el fin de Gran Bretaña en su papel como una de las principales potencias del mundo.
Following the crisis, there was a run on the sterling, on the UK pound. Some people suspect that the American government was encouraging this run on the UK pound.
A medida que los inversionistas retiraban dinero de Gran Bretaña, el valor de la libra disminuía. Para protegerla, Gran Bretaña limitó los préstamos de sus bancos en el extranjero.
They were not able to invest abroad, and obviously they were unhappy. And we don't know exactly the context, but it's very clear that the banks or their representative made a representation to the Bank of England, which in itself was dominated by representatives from the banking industry. It seems that they have reached an agreement which was never written, that if the banks intermediated between two non-residents in a foreign currency, in that case the dollar, then this particular intermediation, this particular deal will not be considered by the Bank of England under its own jurisdiction.
Los bancos comenzaron a crear un mercado de dólares en Londres llamado el mercado del eurodólar, para diferenciar las actividades del mercado del eurodólar de sus actividades bancarias nacionales. Los bancos mantenían dos conjuntos de cuentas. El Banco de Inglaterra, el regulador del Reino Unido, declaró que las cuentas de mercado del eurodólar de Londres no estaban en Londres, sino en otra parte, y por lo tanto no tenía la responsabilidad de regularlas.
It's about providing a legal space in which you pretend activity is taking place. And the importance of that is that you pretend it's not taking place in the economy where it really is taking place. So you're taking activity from the place where it's regulated and taxed and pretending that it's happening elsewhere. Now, where doesn't really matter, it's just elsewhere.
Cuando los bancos estadounidenses se dieron cuenta de que Londres ofrecía la capacidad de evitar las regulaciones de Estados Unidos, trasladaron sus operaciones internacionales a la City. Casi al mismo tiempo que los bancos estadounidenses estaban trasladando sus operaciones internacionales a Londres, otro nuevo tipo de espacio financiero comenzó a surgir, lejos de Londres, en territorios de ultramar de Gran Bretaña, los remanentes del imperio.
Back in the 60s, the Cayman Islands was a complete backwater. The stories go that mosquitoes were so thick in the air sometimes they were enough to suffocate cows. That's a legend that you hear about the Cayman Islands. I don't know how true it was, but there was nothing happening there.
Contadores y abogados de Londres llegaron a las Islas Caimán y otros dominios británicos y comenzaron a redactar un conjunto de leyes y reglamentos financieros secretos. Debido a que el gancho principal era el secreto, se llamaron jurisdicciones secretas.
What the Cayman Islands was doing was straightforwardly illegal activity. Drugs money was coming in huge quantities, tax evasion, whatever you wanted, you could have it.
El Banco de Inglaterra, que observaba los desarrollos desde Londres, señaló en un informe marcado como secreto y fechado el 11 de abril de 1969, tenemos que estar muy seguros de que la posible proliferación de sociedades fiduciarias, bancos y demás, que en la mayoría de los casos no son más que empresas fantasma manipulando activos fuera de las islas, no se nos vaya de las manos. Por supuesto, no hay objeción a que suministren escondrijos a los no residentes, pero tenemos que estar seguros de que así no estemos creando oportunidades para la transferencia de capital del Reino Unido a zonas que no se rigen por la libra y sus normas.
These small territories, the last remnants of the British Empire, which are still overseas territories today, they are still the last remnants of the British Empire. There are 14 of these overseas territories. 7 of them are bona fide tax havens, including the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands. Some of the biggest tax havens in the world today are still British.
Con acceso a grandes cantidades de dinero extranjero, el mercado del eurodólar creció rápidamente. Para 1980 había alcanzado los 500 millones de dólares, en 1988 4.8 billones y para 1997 casi el 90% de todos los préstamos internacionales se hacían a través de este mercado. El imperio británico se había hundido, dejando apenas un rastro, pero la City de Londres se adaptó y sobrevivió. La City de Londres, el distrito financiero de Londres, es un lugar peculiar. Se le ha llamado una ciudad dentro de una ciudad, un estado dentro de un estado. Está a cargo de la llamada Corporación City de Londres, una empresa privada que realiza todas las funciones de un consejo local con policía y tribunales privados.
Those of you who aren't from the UK, some of you even who are, might not be aware just how weird a thing the little city of London is within the big London. The City of London is a separate entity to the wider London, and it has its own head, the Lord Mayor, who's distinct from the Mayor, who runs the rest of London.
Cada noviembre, la ciudad pone en escena el gran espectáculo del alcalde, la procesión municipal más antigua del mundo.
The City of London has long had this curious legal status because back in 1066, when William the Conqueror came over, the city was one of the only portions of England that he failed to conquer, and he struck a deal with the city in 1067 that allowed them to continue functioning.
Todavía hoy, la ciudad de Londres está exenta de numerosas leyes que aplican para el resto de Gran Bretaña. Su sistema político se deriva de la Edad Media. El electorado de la City no está dominado por sus residentes, sino por las empresas privadas que operan dentro. Su alcalde es elegido por los jefes de los gremios medievales.
They have a representative in the House of Commons called the Remembrancer. Apart from the clerks of the House of Commons, he's the only unelected person there.
All other lobbyists have to stop, in the lobby. They're not allowed past the lobby.
La City de Londres tiene un representante permanente en la Cámara de los Comunes, cuya función es mantener a la corporación de la City de Londres informada y presionar al Parlamento.
The Corporation of London, clearly, it's a unique and interesting phenomenon that should have attracted many political scientists, political economists, and economists. But I don't know of anyone who has studied systematically the Corporation of London and its impact on policy or economic policy. So we can only surmise. Some people assume or surmise that the Corporation of London is extremely powerful and is able in one way or another to shape British policy, particularly in financial matters.
Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister after the Second World War, had something to say about the City of London Corporation.
He did, yes. So over and over again, we have seen that there is in this country another power than that which has its seat at Westminster. The City of London, a convenient term for a collection of financial interests, is able to assert itself against the government of the country. Those who control money can pursue a policy at home and abroad, contrary to that which has been decided by the people.
En el corazón de la City de Londres se encuentra el Banco de Inglaterra. El Banco de Inglaterra no es solo un banco central, sino también un regulador financiero. Con la desaparición del imperio, el Banco de Inglaterra usó esa autoridad reguladora para ayudar a traer bancos mundiales a Londres. En 1972, el Banco de Inglaterra emitió una licencia para el Banco de Crédito y Comercio Internacional, estableciendo su sede en Londres. En 10 años, el Banco de Crédito y Comercio Internacional se convirtió en el séptimo banco más grande del mundo. 10 años más tarde, el BCCI quebró.
The deputy director of the CIA, Richard Kerr, said late today that the CIA did use BCCI to support CIA activities overseas.
Pero el BCCI no solo había colaborado con los servicios de inteligencia del mundo, sino que se había involucrado extensamente en fraude financiero, lavado de dinero y financiación de terrorismo.
BCCI constituted international global crime of a level that boggles the mind.
BCCI was financing terrorism. The Bank of England knew it, says the report, but instead of supervising it properly, it tried to prevent the bank's collapse.
I am saying very directly that the Bank of England had sufficient information in front of it to close BCCI 15 months earlier than it did. Millions of depositors were hurt in that process.
Muchos denunciantes del BCCI contactaron al Banco de Inglaterra. Sin embargo, el Banco de Inglaterra no hizo nada.
The Bank of England had plenty of time to intervene and investigate, but it did not do so because the tradition at that time, which still survives, is that, well, actually, you have to just kind of send hints and talk over lunch tables with the chaps regulating other chaps, and all would be well.
Robin Lee Pemberton, el gobernador del Banco de Inglaterra en el momento del colapso del BCCI, comentó: "El actual sistema de supervisión ha servido bien a la comunidad. Si cerramos un banco cada vez que encontramos un indicio de fraude, tendríamos muchos menos bancos que los que tenemos en este momento". Londres era un lugar en el que los bancos participaban en negocios que no estaban permitidos en otros lugares, donde los directivos de bancos no tenían que preocuparse por las consecuencias de sus acciones. Esta es una de las razones por las que hoy hay más bancos en Londres que en cualquier otro centro financiero.
In Britain, nobody goes to jail. No bankers go to jail. They generally don't. They are a protected species, and that is part of the offshore business model of the UK, is to say, we will protect you, we will bring your money here, we will look after you, we're not going to put you in prison, we'll let you do what you want.
Regulación ligera fue una manera de atraer negocios a Londres. Otra fue la confidencialidad. Desde la década de los 60, las instituciones de la City de Londres comenzaron a establecer sucursales en el extranjero, en los antiguos puestos de avanzada del imperio británico. Su objetivo era crear centros en el extranjero con una legislación de estricta confidencialidad para atraer capitales de todo el mundo.
Swiss banking secrecy is the most famous, the most well-known. You put your money in a Swiss bank and they promise not to tell anybody, and that's one kind of secrecy. But another kind of secrecy, which is very British, is the trust. And the trust is a very slippery, complicated and devious mechanism. Trusts emerged, the legend has it, from the time of the Crusades, when the knights would go off and fight in foreign lands, and they would leave their assets in the care of trusted stewards.
What trusts do ultimately is they play with the concept of ownership. Ownership is not such a simple thing. So the settlor, the knight in this case, would hand over the assets to someone who these days would be called a trustee. It's often a lawyer. Legally, you are separated from those assets. They're not yours anymore. There's a barrier. You can't be taxed on them. Nobody's going to find anything about your connection to these assets.
En las jurisdicciones de paraísos fiscales de Gran Bretaña no se necesitan requisitos para ser administrador. Cualquiera puede crear un fideicomiso y actuar como fiduciario. No existe un registro de fideicomisos. No hay entidades para certificar el establecimiento de fideicomisos.
The only persons who know about the creation of this agreement are the trustee and the settlor. There's no obligation to register it. There is no financial reporting obligation of trusts. They're not required to put annual statements onto account anywhere. So actually trusts are, to all intents and purposes, invisible arrangements.
El economista John Christensen fue el asesor económico de la jurisdicción confidencial de Jersey por 10 años.
We're not talking about a few million. We're talking now about trillions. Trillions of dollars of capital, which apparently belong to nobody. For tax purposes and for other purposes, they belong to nobody. Everything, works of arts, gold bullion, racehorses, cars, real estate, not just financial assets, but a whole load of non-financial assets belong to these trusts, sitting there belonging to nobody. Now think that one through, because we are talking about maybe as much as $50 trillion of assets sitting offshore behind these instruments.
Well, the Cayman Islands are among several British overseas territories who have signed a new information exchange agreement with Britain and the rest of Europe to tackle tax evasion. The countries are now required to automatically provide details of the ownership of bank accounts and how they're used. Cayman became the first signatory last week.
It's important that the Cayman Islands should be recognised as the first overseas territory to sign such an agreement with the United Kingdom. And I think this importantly reflects the constructive approach that the Cayman Islands has taken in delivering our shared objective of rooting out tax evasion.
The trust lies at the core of the British secrecy model. They don't use banking secrecy. The Swiss use banking secrecy. The British, of course, are only too willing to kill off banking secrecy because they will then capture a larger market share. That's why the Brits are doing this.
Los fideicomisos son el componente básico de la confidencialidad anglosajona y forman la base sobre la cual se crean estructuras de paraísos fiscales complejas. Cada jurisdicción secreta ofrece un conjunto específico de servicios, desde depósitos a empresas fantasma a cuentas bancarias secretas y directores nominales. La combinación de servicios en estructuras complejas que abarcan múltiples jurisdicciones permite la creación de estructuras secretas que son casi imposibles de penetrar.
An offshore structure will often have a trust kind of sitting at the top of it. The trust will be here managing the assets, kind of controlling the assets. Underneath it, the trust will own some shell companies. Each one might be in a different jurisdiction. So you might have a trust in one jurisdiction whose trustees are somewhere else, whose beneficiaries are somewhere else, which owns offshore companies somewhere else. Each of these companies might then own assets, so that they might own, a bank account, a racehorse, a yacht, a painting, a portfolio of shares or whatever.
Hay cantidades de variaciones de fideicomisos y estructuras de paraísos fiscales confidenciales. Hay abogados en paraísos fiscales cuyo trabajo consiste en crear estructuras cada vez más complejas y ocultas. El objetivo de estas estructuras es ocultar la identidad de los propietarios de bienes en paraísos fiscales y permitir que esta riqueza circule nuevamente en los mercados globales.
Looking on the amount of money being administrated from tax havens, you see that it is a curve going like this. And all the talking we have been doing along with other wonderful people fighting against tax havens has not changed anything, It is the word where you say, go on talking, you're interesting me, and I'm going on doing what I want to do. We know everything today because we have had the Panama Papers, we have seen it, and we are not able to act upon it. And we are not able to act upon it because this system is really protecting the few people that are having benefit from it. And these are in percentage very few people, but they are powerful. And I see in the Panama committee that I'm sitting in, the only thing that could change this is to have a public accessible register of the beneficial ownership of trusts and of all kinds of companies. It is easy.
Los documentos de Panamá son una colección de filtraciones de la firma de abogados de paraísos fiscales Mossack Fonseca. Mossack Fonseca es el cuarto bufete de abogados más grande de paraísos fiscales. Los otros 9 de los 10 más grandes están registrados en jurisdicciones británicas de ultramar. Cuando los países se quejan con Gran Bretaña acerca de las actividades que se desarrollan en sus paraísos fiscales, la respuesta británica es que son independientes y que no hay nada que pueda hacer.
I've heard time and time again from officials in Berlin and in Paris and in Washington and in other countries that they've been told by the British government that yes, they're well aware of what's going on in Jersey and they think it's very unfortunate, but they don't have the powers to intervene. Well, that's a straightforward lie. They do have the powers to intervene. They just choose not to.
Britain plays this kind of game of pretending, when it suits them, to pretend that these places are independent. At the end of the day, Britain appoints the governor, appoints lots of senior people in these places. They're responsible for foreign relations and defence, and also they can veto their legislation as well. So Britain has a massive degree of control. Basically, it is controlling these places, allowing them a little bit of political space.
Durante su tiempo como asesor económico de Jersey, John Christensen viajó con frecuencia a Londres para reunirse con varios departamentos del gobierno británico.
As economic advisor, I had a lot of contact with different departments. Traditionally, UK governments have tried not to interfere in the domestic affairs of places like Jersey. So it happens in a more subtle sort of way. You kind of go and talk to someone either at the Home Office or the Treasury, and they'd say, well, I'm not actually particularly keen on this piece of legislation. It might be a good idea if you didn't go down that route. And over a cup of tea, that's quite a strong signal. That's a signal, go back to the island and say, they don't want you to do this.
El gobierno británico prefiere no interferir abiertamente. En cambio, comunica sus deseos a través de conversaciones informales. No hay rastros de papel o declaraciones oficiales. Las conversaciones se llevan a cabo a puerta cerrada.
The relationship that these places have with London is very much about the British establishment and people understanding each other. I mean, anybody who is British or knows British people knows that communication between us is often very subtle, and you have to kind of know the codes when people say stuff. I mean, a lot of irony involved and a lot of kind of codified language of the British establishment that people kind of understand how it works. And I think that is very much the case with the British relationship with the tax havens. I think there's a lot of understanding of what we can and can't do without anyone having to actually spell it out.
Al mantener su poder oculto, Gran Bretaña puede decir que estas jurisdicciones son políticamente autónomas.
Independence for Cayman is not on government's agenda. That's the message being sent to the UN Special Committee on Decolonization. Attorney Steve McPhail will be representing government at the UN meeting. The committee was set up to help colonies around the world on the road to independence. But Mr. McPhail says he'll be making it clear that Cayman is not ready for that transition.
And that message is that the Premier, his cabinet, his party has no mandate from the people of the Cayman Islands to seek independence. That is the message that I will be carrying.
Cuando las Bahamas declaró su independencia de Gran Bretaña en 1967, los banqueros de paraísos fiscales se reubicaron en las Islas Caimán y desde allí continuaron su negocio. La conexión británica hizo que los banqueros y sus clientes se sintieran seguros de que su dinero estaba a salvo.
This British bedrock, that is what has allowed these places to become so trusted by the financial services industry and offshore finance and all these people.
En realidad, gran parte de la riqueza administrada en paraísos fiscales británicos se controla desde Londres.
The City of London, by and large, likes to do its really dirty work outside London. There might, heaven forbid, be a regulator who actually takes the job seriously and starts to prosecute them for fraud in London. So better to do the frauds offshore in Gibraltar or Jersey, where there's much less risk that a serious prosecution will ever happen.
Los tratos son a menudo discutidos y cerrados en Londres, pero luego registrados en paraísos fiscales, por razones impositivas, regulatorias y de transparencia.
What they allow the city to do is to get involved in dirty business, but then when the scandal hits, to say, well, they're kind of independent, there's nothing we can do about those places, that's not us, that's tax haven activity, and we're the city, you know, we're not involved in that kind of stuff. So it's an incredibly kind of convenient relationship.
The City of London has shaped the way in which Jersey, Guernsey and the British Overseas Territories have developed as tax havens. I see these places as the Frankensteins created by the City of London.
Hoy en día, el Reino Unido es el mayor proveedor mundial de servicios financieros internacionales.
The UK has an almost unique role in global finance. If you look at data, the kind of data that we've constructed in the Financial Secrecy Index, you can see the relative shares of each country in the global provision of financial services exports. That's financial services to non-residents. Now, there are two big centres and everything else is quite small in comparison.
Los dos grandes centros son los Estados Unidos con alrededor del 19% del mercado mundial y el Reino Unido junto con sus jurisdicciones de alta mar que tienen alrededor de 25% del mercado global.
And if you add to that other jurisdictions, ex-colonies, but recently independent, fairly recently, by which I mean Hong Kong, Singapore, maybe even Dubai and Bahrain, and Cyprus, then you reach a figure of nearly 40%. And I think that figure represents better the position of London in the global financial market.
The soldiers left, the administrators left all the colonies, but they still kept a significant degree of control over the financial flows from these former parts of empire and the rest of the world. So you could describe it as a second empire, Britain's second empire, sort of hidden financial empire spanning large parts of the globe.
En los tiempos del Imperio Británico, la City de Londres era el más grande centro financiero del mundo. No solo las colonias de Gran Bretaña, sino también países independientes hacían sus transacciones bancarias en Londres y usaban la moneda del imperio para el comercio y las finanzas. A medida que el imperio declinaba, también lo hacía la City. El establecimiento del mercado del eurodólar en Londres habilitaba a los bancos de la City de Londres a seguir explotando sus redes y experiencia de la época del imperio, y la creación de jurisdicciones confidenciales dio a los bancos acceso a grandes cantidades de dinero barato. Los bancos internacionales de todo el mundo establecieron sucursales en Londres y las jurisdicciones de alta mar de Gran Bretaña con el fin de aprovechar las ventajas de este nuevo sistema.
This system has taken the place of the occupation, up till 62. For France, I don't know for England, but about the same time, England were physically present in India, for instance, or in other colonies. And when you look at the money flows through the tax havens, they are increasing when we withdraw from the colonies. We are still plundering developing countries as former colonial powers.
Individuos ricos, el crimen organizado y las empresas pusieron su riqueza en paraísos fiscales a cambio de confidencialidad y no tener que pagar impuestos. Y a medida que los países de todo el mundo comenzaron a desregular y abrir sus economías, se volvió cada vez más fácil hacerlo. Hoy en día, aproximadamente la mitad de toda la riqueza mundial en paraísos fiscales puede estar oculta en jurisdicciones confidenciales de Gran Bretaña. Uno de los perdedores es África, cuya fuga de capital fluye sobre todo hacia las modernas redes de araña británicas.
I think it's no coincidence that Britain's offshore empire emerged more or less at the same time as the collapse of the former empire.
We tend to think of Africa as being a huge net debtor to the rest of the world. But that was the extent of their debts at the end of 2008, 177 billion.
La deuda de las naciones del África subsahariana se situó en 177 mil millones de dólares en 2008. Sin embargo, la riqueza que las élites de estos países había trasladado a paraísos fiscales entre 1970 y 2008 se estima en 944 mil millones de dólares, más de 5 veces su deuda externa.
944 billion dollars. Do the maths. Far from being a net debtor, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is a net creditor to the rest of the world.
A medida que el capital se trasladaba a paraísos fiscales, los países africanos pedían dinero prestado a los bancos internacionales a altas tasas de interés. Con el tiempo, estas deudas se hicieron tan grandes que es posible que jamás puedan ser devueltas. Las jurisdicciones confidenciales estaban privando a las naciones en desarrollo de sus impuestos y su riqueza.
For a long time, a lot of developing countries, including recently Ecuador, have been trying to set up a UN tax body which is of a higher value than what is currently there, which is the UN Tax Committee. And every time this has happened, it has gotten blocked. During the financing for development process in Addis Ababa last year, I think it was the UK and the US that blocked attempts again to set up this World Tax Organization. So why would they not want to have democratic decision making in global decisions on how tax gets collected across borders? I don't understand this. As long as we have cross-border activity that involves both criminal and legal activity, as long as we're unable to separate the two, this is going to continue to be a problem.
Las naciones occidentales bloquean los intentos por lograr una mayor transparencia de los flujos financieros internacionales y la implementación de estándares globales para el cobro de impuestos a través de las fronteras, mientras que las élites de las naciones en desarrollo utilizan los centros de paraísos fiscales para ocultar su riqueza muy lejos.
The oil from Gabon has not benefited people in Gabon. And this is true for the copper in Zambia, for the gold in Mozambique or in Mali. They have benefited the company that do extract it, and they are shareholders. It has benefited the corrupt elite in the country.
In developing countries, the offshore system of tax havens has facilitated the looting of these countries by their elites. It has enabled them to steal the money and keep it safe somewhere else.
Illicit financial flows, because the anonymity that drives them creates incentives for people in positions of power to be corrupt. This is why there's a group of countries where development progress is so difficult. It's that the incentives of individuals and the ability to pursue them through all the mechanisms that underpin illicit flows outweigh the type of mechanisms that lead you to a powerful, representative, effective state that can start to deliver development.
A nivel mundial, los países en desarrollo pierden más de $1 billón cada año en la fuga de capitales y la evasión de impuestos. La mayor parte de esta riqueza fluye hacia grandes naciones occidentales, como Estados Unidos y Gran Bretaña, y posibilita que sus monedas se mantengan fuertes mientras que las naciones en desarrollo se mantienen débiles. Sin embargo, los flujos ilícitos hacia los países occidentales tuvieron otro efecto secundario inesperado. Las economías de Estados Unidos y Gran Bretaña comenzaron a financiarizarse, es decir, a quedar dominadas por el sector financiero. Los orígenes de esta financiarización o desindustrialización se remontan a la década de 1960.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, in mass marches, rallies, and demonstrations. President Johnson, meanwhile, let it be known that the FBI is closely watching all anti-war activity.
En la década de 1960, el economista estadounidense Michael Hudson trabajaba en el banco Chase Manhattan en Wall Street como economista de balanza de pagos.
During the 1960s, the United States balance of payments deficit was entirely a result of foreign military expenditures.
Los dólares fluían hacia afuera de los Estados Unidos como resultado del costo de la guerra de Vietnam. Estados Unidos intentó evitar que los dólares que fluían a Vietnam fueran depositados en bancos extranjeros.
The government asked Chase to set up a branch in Saigon during the Vietnam War, and as you can imagine, it didn't have windows. It was sort of a fortress. It lost money, but the government went to Chase because it said, if you don't get this money that's being thrown off by the military in Vietnam, then it's going to go into French banks. It'll get to General de Gaulle, and you know what he's going to do every month. He's going to cash it in for gold. That's what the United States was trying to stop.
Los Estados Unidos no tuvieron éxito en detener la pérdida de dinero, por lo que comenzaron a tramar un plan diferente. En 1967, un ex empleado del Departamento de Estado le entregó una nota a Michael Hudson.
In 1967, I was given by a former State Department employee in the elevator at Chase Manhattan a memo from the State Department urging that Chase Manhattan would take the lead in helping the United States become the Switzerland of the world, meaning the flight capital. The State Department, through Chase, asked me to estimate how much money do you think is available if America were to become the new Switzerland, and how do we do it? The plan was to organize offshore banking centers in the Caribbean and elsewhere, and the hot money wouldn't come directly into Chase because that wouldn't be nice and very legal. What happened was that the Latin American criminals, other criminals, drug dealers, all sorts of organized crime, would put their money in the offshore Caribbean banks, and these offshore banks would then deposit the inflow in the head office.
Al mover dólares de los paraísos fiscales de nuevo hacia los Estados Unidos, podían detener la salida de dólares y mantener el valor de su moneda.
every country looks to its foreign exchange rate. And the foreign exchange rate is not only imports and exports, it's capital movements. And if you look at the International Monetary Fund's monthly international financial statistics, you have sort of a steady balance of trade, a steady immigrants' remittances. What goes up and down are called errors and omissions. What the United Nations and the IMF call errors and omissions are flight capital. It's the reason that it's omitted is they don't like to really look at this. In the 1930s, Roy Ovid Hall, economist for the U.S. Commerce Department, wanted to include criminal movements in the balance of payment statistics. And Congress got very upset. I was told in Washington the argument was, we're a Christian country. We don't want to report crime. It's just, don't look at it. And they forbid him to include criminal money in the balance of payments. I guess now you call it errors and omissions. You don't call it criminal inflow and outflow.
En la década de 1960 y 70, Gran Bretaña se enfrentó a un dilema similar al de los Estados Unidos. El dinero salía y eso disminuía el valor de la libra. Gran Bretaña se dio cuenta también que podía apoyar el valor de su moneda abriendo su mercado interno a los billones de dólares que pasaban a través de sus paraísos fiscales. Pero al igual que en los Estados Unidos, esto tuvo un efecto secundario inesperado.
The British banks today, just as in the 19th century, don't put their money into British manufacturing. They put their money into real estate speculation, into financial speculation, foreign currency trade. So the financialization of London has helped deindustrialize the country because it's enabled sterling to be supported by this huge inflow of hot money, this inflow of drug dealing money and criminal money and tax evasion money all over the world that is going to London instead of going to Switzerland, Liechtenstein, or the Caribbean.
Con el respaldo tácito de los Estados Unidos, los paraísos fiscales de Gran Bretaña crecieron rápidamente y en poco tiempo este sistema se convirtió en el mercado financiero internacional dominante del mundo. Pocos eran conscientes de cómo funcionaba este mercado. En 1986, el economista John Christensen decidió investigar los paraísos fiscales. Solicitó un puesto en la oficina de Jersey de una de las principales firmas de contabilidad del mundo.
At Deloitte & Touche, I was working in what's called company and trust administration, straightforward offshore stuff. I went offshore specifically to work in that area because that's where you're dealing with the offshore companies, the shell companies, the offshore trusts, and you're administering them. That way I could see from working inside a big global accounting firm exactly what the clients were doing.
I had complete access to all the client files. And over the course of my period of working with Deloitte & Touche, I investigated over 100 of their clients offshore, and this is what I found. There were some insider traders, some market rigging, some avoiding disclosure of conflicts of interest, illicit arms trading, illicit political campaign donations, contract kickbacks, bribery, fraudulent invoicing, trade mispricing, and at the bottom, tax evasion. Okay? This is what the clients were doing.
On the basis of a sample of the clients that I looked at, not a single client was involved in what I would regard as genuinely legitimate activity. They were all involved in some kind of tax dodging or worse.
I met with Carl Levin. He used to be an American senator, and he made a lot of inquiries into private banking, asking questions to the bankers. What do you think the percentage is among your clients that are using these companies for legitimate purposes? And the answer was, I believe that 99.9% of my clients are using these companies for illicit purposes. This is a reality. This is American bankers telling what they are doing. And it's exactly the same thing with UK bankers helping their clients to have accounts in Panama or in Bermuda or in Cayman Islands.
Las jurisdicciones secretas son muy usadas para las actividades fraudulentas y áreas grises financieras, áreas donde el secreto no es solo deseable sino una necesidad. La actividad financiera legítima no tiene ninguna necesidad de la confidencialidad que los paraísos fiscales proporcionan, ni un deseo de pagar los altos honorarios que cobran los bancos y bufetes de abogados de paraísos fiscales. Hoy en día, casi la mitad de las jurisdicciones secretas del mundo son dependencias británicas. En público, estas jurisdicciones dicen que son transparentes y que sus sectores de servicios financieros se dedican a actividades financieras legítimas.
Our economy is not based on secrecy. It's based on transparency. It's based on a sound regulatory environment. It's based on good governance and good government with a British government legal system. That's what our financial institutions are based on.
Well, tonight we have a response from the head of Cayman Finance after a group of U.S.-based anti-tax evasion activists announced plans to travel to Cayman to draw attention to what they feel is corporate tax evasion. Finance Chairman Mr. Richard Cole says he's encouraging the group to visit and says our financial sector has nothing to hide.
I would say if anybody wants to come to Cayman to find out what's coming, what we do here, come on down. We have no secrets here.
When I went to the Cayman Islands back in 2008, I think it was, I called the government spokesman and he said, okay, we have had an order from on high that nobody is allowed to speak to you. You are off limits.
En 2011, el periodista Nicholas Saxon publicó Las Islas del Tesoro, un libro pionero sobre el sistema de paraísos fiscales.
The author of a series of international media reports says he would welcome a debate with Cayman Finance Chair Tony Travers. Mr. Travers recently called Nicholas Saxon an imbecile with the understanding of an 11-year-old.
There are always going to be the politics of envy. Now, the politics of envy are exacerbated by imbeciles who don't actually understand what's going on in the Cayman Islands. I don't know what he's talking about. And furthermore, he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Las Islas Caimán son el quinto centro financiero más grande del mundo. Tiene 80.000 empresas registradas, más de 3/4 partes de los fondos de cobertura de alto riesgo del mundo y 1.9 billones en depósitos. Tiene una población de 60.000 habitantes y aproximadamente equivalente a los sin techo de Nueva York. Una extraña mezcla de personajes puebla el mundo de paraísos fiscales. Exalumnos de colegios públicos británicos, miembros de los servicios de inteligencia del mundo, criminales globales, lores y damas surtidos y banqueros en abundancia. Con tanto en juego para tantos individuos ricos y poderosos, puede que no sea una sorpresa que los paraísos fiscales británicos hayan desarrollado curiosos mecanismos para prevenir la filtración de información.
For many people who work offshore and who don't like what they're doing, it's very hard indeed to dissent because they will be attacked personally with a degree of viciousness which is quite extraordinary. Most of the time, the instruments of suppression are relatively sophisticated. You won't get promotion by doing this, or your family won't like it.
It's not generally, let's slam them in prison. That's far too crude. We are talking about very substantially, the establishment, the British establishment in these cases. The mechanisms are very, very subtle. Sort of ostracism is one way of doing it. These peculiar mechanisms for, if someone tries to blow the whistle, you find all sorts of methods that aren't just fire them, you give them far too much work to do, you steer them in a different direction.
Una persona que está íntimamente familiarizada con las formas de represión en los paraísos fiscales es el ex senador de Jersey y ministro de Salud, Stuart Siveray. En 2009, él filtró un informe sobre una enfermera acusada de matar a pacientes en el hospital de Jersey.
It all came to a head during a state's debate on Tuesday the 10th of March. Senator Stuart Siveray brought the sitting to a standstill, claiming Senator Jimmy Pershard had sworn at him and told him to go and top himself. Senator Pershard denied the claim, saying, "I absolutely refute that." But less than a week later, he was forced to admit he had lied. Senator Pershard has now admitted that on another occasion he did tell Senator Stuart Sivray to go and do everyone a favour and slit his wrists.
I was arrested at my house one morning by 6 plainclothes police officers. There were another 2 specialist data search police officers on hand, and also another 2 police officers in full body armour with one of those battering rams they kind of use in drugs raids. So 10 police officers descended on me without a search warrant. The property was turned over from top to bottom. All of the computers were seized and searched. All kinds of private constituency data was stolen by the police.
Poco después de comenzar el rodaje, un oficial de policía salió de la estación y cuando pasaba sonrió a la cámara. El oficial iba en camino de probar las sirenas de su moto, lo que hizo a intervalos durante gran parte del resto de la entrevista.
When it came to prosecuting me,
Stuart Sivray fue procesado en virtud de la Ley de Protección de Datos.
Now, when the authorities were prosecuting me, I claimed that this was a legitimate public interest disclosure defence, and I, with an expert witness, was able to produce a set of reports that effectively destroyed the prosecution case.
En reacción a esto, los jueces decidieron que la defensa de Stuart Sivray, que había filtrado el informe en interés del público, ya no sería admisible, pero el juicio continuó de todas formas sin defensa. Durante los últimos 7 años, Stuart Sivray ha sido repetidamente llevado a los tribunales y encarcelado 3 veces. Él no sabe si la persecución va a terminar ni sabe cuándo se encontrará nuevamente tras las rejas.
To look at Jersey from the outside, it looks like it's got a prosecution system, it looks like it's got a court and a legislature, but none of it's real. It's a Potemkin village. None of these systems in Jersey meet the tests of being objective or actually functioning properly.
The experience that Stuart Sivray had is, he's perhaps at the blunter end of the scale. He was simply suppressed and taken to court on trumped-up charges.
So let's carry on pretending to do the interview. They might get bored. This is the kind of how oppression happens in Jersey. You see, all kinds of little things get done to harass people. Even they don't often go to the kind of extremes that they did against me in terms of actually arresting me and putting me in prison. But the authorities use all kinds of other lesser little methods to interfere with people, kind of sabotage things. Obstruct people, make life difficult for people. If you annoy the establishment in Jersey, you won't get a job here. Your children won't get decent jobs. That's kind of how it works.
I went to Jersey in March 2009 with Nick Shaxson. About 24 hours after we arrived in Jersey, we were there for several days. Nick said, have you noticed that we're being followed? Ever since we arrived at the airport, we've been followed. He said, don't look now, but we're being followed now. Turns out he was quite correct. We were being followed. And I found that very disturbing indeed.
En Jersey tienen un dicho: si no te gusta, siempre hay un barco por la mañana. La literatura promocional de finanzas en Jersey asegura: Jersey representa una extensión de la City de Londres.
It's where the City of London chooses to do many of the activities which they couldn't do in London itself.
We're here just to talk about this one company called Appleby. I'll just read what they say on their website. Members of the firm, Appleby, have gone on not only to political office, but also in a number of centres, Bermuda, Jersey, the Isle of Man and the Cayman Islands, to senior judicial office. So essentially, they're boasting of the fact that their staff and their partners have a real interchange between the people that are in power in these offshore financial centres.
Los mismos abogados y contadores que configuran y administran fideicomisos en paraísos fiscales ocupan también altos cargos políticos. En el mundo de paraísos fiscales de Gran Bretaña, la mayoría de los políticos hacen negocios, ejercen presión a favor de los negocios y promueven los intereses comerciales, redactan, refinan y aprueban leyes. Los políticos se sientan en los consejos de administración de las empresas que se supone deben regular.
There is no place for dirty money in Britain. Indeed, there should be no place for dirty money anywhere. The challenge I'm laying down for every country today is to root out the rot of corruption, to ensure transparency over what your own companies are doing, require transparency for foreign companies in your country too, and work with us to spread this approach to transparency around the world.
En público, los políticos británicos aseguran que ellos están tomando medidas contra las jurisdicciones secretas y la corrupción, pero en la práctica hacen lo contrario.
When I talk to politicians in Brussels, they say that they've had more lobbyists from London, and including politicians, come to them to protect the City of London's interests than they've had from every other European member state combined, which gives you some idea of the extent to which British politicians see themselves as essentially lobbyists for the City of London.
We begin with our big story. Cayman's efforts to ensure transparency in its financial services sector is being recognised by the international community. Earlier this week, the UK's Prime Minister David Cameron told Parliament that the tax haven label placed on its crown dependencies and overseas territories is unfair.
Muchos políticos británicos tienen vínculos personales y de negocios con la City de Londres y las jurisdicciones secretas británicas. El padre del ex primer ministro británico David Cameron, Ian Cameron, fue un experto en fondos de paraísos fiscales y participó en fideicomisos de paraísos fiscales desde la década de 1980.
At this courthouse behind me here in St Helier, we found this. It's a document called a grant of probate, and it's attached to the English will of none other than Ian Cameron, David Cameron's father.
Say hello to Mum and Dad. Hi, Bar, how are you? Good to see you.
Ian Cameron was certainly a wealthy man. In 2009, his personal fortune was estimated by researchers for the Sunday Times Rich List at £10 million. Yet, when Ian Cameron died in 2010, his estate was much smaller than might be expected, just £2.7 million.
In many cases, it's the politicians and their cronies and their families and so on, and the business people who sponsor the political parties, who are using these offshore services themselves. So they've got no personal interest in closing it down. If they wanted to close it down, they could do it tomorrow. The fact of the matter is they don't want to do it because they themselves are complicit with the process.
If you come from the same kind of background, you know the right people, then all the kind of legal niceties will often fall away. You can get away with doing all sorts of things that they wouldn't just let any old person, you know, if you came knocking on the door saying, can you set up an offshore company to do this, they'd tell you to get lost. But if you're part of the networks, you can do these kinds of things. So that's a very important part of the whole system. Upper class British public school kind of establishment that has been there since, for centuries.
La dirigencia británica, un club de viejos muchachos de las élites privilegiadas, había creado un nicho lucrativo para sí mismos en el mundo de paraísos fiscales después de la desaparición del imperio. Ellos se transformaron en los administradores del imperio, en los manipuladores financieros para la élite global y las corporaciones multinacionales. A medida que más dinero fluyó a paraísos fiscales, las sociedades de todo el mundo comenzaron a sentir el impacto del mundo de paraísos fiscales.
The reality is not what you believe, that your prime minister has the power to decide on the future of your country. The power is hidden here.
We have country after country around the world where the lack of financial transparency about taxation, about ownership, about corruption has undermined the extent to which governments deliver representative policymaking for their citizens. We have extreme cases like the hiding of tax evasion by people in finance ministries in Greece, in France. But we also have this system that in general is geared towards anonymous company ownership, the anonymous ownership of properties across London, of half of the land in Scotland. Do we really think there's any circumstances in which governments work better, in which markets work better, in which the distribution of income and assets is better, when we allow so much to be hidden? Who wants to not know who you're doing business with? Who wants their government to have people working for it, or to be led by people whose assets are hidden, whose financial transactions are conducted anonymously offshore? This is a bad direction for the world.
We need the citizens to understand what is happening, that they are the ones who is carrying the burden, and that some individuals having the power are exonerating themselves. Ordinary people are paying taxes, rich people are not. So this is inequality, and it is leading up to populism, because it shows so clearly that the people today leading the world are not able to take care of the interest of ordinary people.
Back in the 60s and 70s, tax evasion or pushing back against taxation, it was kind of seen as anti-establishment. So, the Rolling Stones and Phil Collins, all these people kind of going offshore, going away. It was seen as a sort of rebellious thing to do. And if you fast forward to the present day, now that is the establishment. The offshore system is the establishment.
Hoy en día, los paraísos fiscales son la forma como las élites y corporaciones multinacionales conducen sus negocios. La evasión de impuestos es la manera de hacer negocios.
This kind of sophisticated cheating requires a huge infrastructure. We like to talk about the pinstripe infrastructure of highly educated people who think it is their right to help others to cheat societies.
We have a new mafia in town. It does not actually shoot people, does not put bullets in their kneecaps, but its trade is just as deadly. It deprives people of opportunities to have healthcare, education, security, justice, and essentially a fulfilling life.
Los contadores forman la columna vertebral del sistema de paraísos fiscales. Ellos administran las estructuras que permiten a los individuos y empresas llevar su dinero lejos y evadir impuestos.
There are about 2.5 million professionally qualified accountants on this planet. About 330,000 are in the UK.
Well-known people, well-dressed, well-fed, highly paid, are sitting in city centre offices, and they are paid to dream up tax avoidance schemes for individuals and for corporations.
We can all elect a government which says, vote for us, we will give you better healthcare, better education, better security. And next day accountant says, sorry about that folks, you elected this government, but we actually got a tax avoidance scheme, and the Amazons and the Googles and Microsofts won't be paying any taxes in your jurisdiction. Too bad you voted for it, but actually you're going to get something else.
So it's a crazy world that part of the business model at big accountancy firms is how to deny public the services by erosion of tax revenues. And these firms are then rewarded with government-funded contracts, and the same firms are then advising local governments and the central governments, and the same firms then report on the company accounts and tell us all is well.
When I argue this with a Pricewaterhouse partner in a face-to-face debate, he said, Professor Sicker, you never give us credit for anything. We generate millions of dollars of revenues, and we have lots and lots of satisfied clients. What is your problem? And my response was very simple, that's the language of drug pushers and pimps.
Una nueva casta de funcionarios estaba llegando a la cima de Gran Bretaña. Uno de esos funcionarios fue David Hartnett, quien llegó a la cima de HMRC, la autoridad impositiva del Reino Unido. Dave Hartnett tenía una nueva forma de recaudación de impuestos. Los pactos se negociarían uno a uno, a puerta cerrada. En los casos de los clientes más grandes con frecuencia, Dave Hartnett hacía las negociaciones en persona. British Telecom fue una de las primeras empresas del programa y recibió un reembolso de más de 1 billón de libras. El presidente ejecutivo de BT, Ben Verweyden, escribió: "Las ganancias por acción subieron un 14% y es agradable saber que tenemos un crédito de 1 billón de libras del recaudador de impuestos". Dave Hartnett sostenía que este enfoque era más eficiente.
Litigation in the courts is really phenomenally expensive in this day and age all over the world, and I think it's to be avoided where possible. And the art is to persuade people to pay by strength of argument and the like.
Después de que estallaron las protestas en 2011, la Comisión Especial del Tesoro cuestionó a Dave Hartnett. Dave Hartnett dijo que no podía dar ninguna información debido a la confidencialidad del contribuyente.
What in statute prevents you from disclosing information to Parliament?
All my advice, Mr. Barclay, so far has been that I am prevented, and my colleagues are prevented, by the Act and by the decision of the Commissioners.
Dave Hartnett no mencionó que la asesoría jurídica que había recibido declaraba que la divulgación de información era una decisión que debía tomar el mismo jefe de HMRC. El jefe de HMRC era el mismísimo Dave Hartnett.
Just like the mafia has penetrated the state, accountancy firms have also penetrated the state. At the head of anti-avoidance in the UK, tax authority is from one of these firms. The newly appointed chairman of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which is a tax authority, is a partner from KPMG. Their partners have penetrated the state. They are running the treasury.
La industria de servicios financieros de Gran Bretaña había penetrado el Estado y comenzó a darle forma a sus leyes para su propio beneficio.
The degree of political capture by the City of London, by the big banks and the big law firms, is so enormous that the politicians have effectively become their spokespersons.
Como el gobierno no quiere actuar por el interés público, un grupo de manifestantes se enfrentó a Dave Hartnett en un evento privado en Oxford.
Hi everybody, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just going to take a few moments of your time. Here tonight to present Dave with an award. It is the Lifetime Achievement Award for services to corporate tax planning.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dave's been a great friend to the industry, a great friend to many of us over the years, and really we just can't thank him enough for what he's done.
Obviously us at Vodafone, it saved us billions off our tax bill, and our friends at Goldman Sachs as well, we've also saved us millions as well.
25 million or so.
These people are trespassers and intruders.
And I know you've had problems with
This is an unlawful conspiracy to trespass. And you will go, sir. You will depart immediately before we set the dogs on you. Go. You're trespassing.
So sorry. Please
You are trespassing, scum. Go.
Después de su retiro, Dave Hartnett pasó al sector privado. Uno de sus puestos es con la firma de contabilidad Deloitte, donde asesora a gobiernos extranjeros en impuestos empresariales. Dave Hartnett es un compañero de la Orden del Baño, honor conferido a él por el monarca británico.
We have former ministers acting as advisors to accountancy firms. Accountancy firms provide jobs and consultancies for potential ministers. To my mind, really, it's an indication of corrupt structures. People are buying and selling influences. When a former minister works for an accountancy firm, he's not providing any accounting knowledge, he's opening political opportunities, home and abroad. That is what they are doing.
I hope by now you'll share my view that I don't trust most bankers, I don't trust most lawyers, I don't trust most accounting firms. I actually think they're engaged in a conspiracy against public interest.
En Gran Bretaña, la confidencialidad y la complejidad de las finanzas y el gobierno ayudan a ocultar la corrupción en la función pública. Las estructuras financieras son a menudo tan complejas que incluso después de ser reveladas públicamente no se reconocen ampliamente por lo que son. Un ejemplo de esto es PFI, la iniciativa de financiación privada.
PFI is Private Finance Initiative. It is a way of funding public infrastructure, things like hospitals, schools, roads and bridges, but financing them via the private sector rather than the historical method, which is via central government. Over a period of 30 or 40 years, the amount of kind of repayment costs will be sort of 3 or 4 times higher overall than if you'd borrowed it from central government in the first place. So it's basically a giant accounting scam. Once the PFI policy has been set up, you find that the big 4 accountancy firms were actually paid members of staff within the Treasury Department who were then actually going around and selling and advising upon the implementation of PFI contracts by public authorities.
Effectively saying, come to us and we will show you how to derive the most benefit from it. In other words, how to perhaps exploit the legislation.
Even the offices of the state tax authority are now owned offshore. HMRC, which is the tax collector here in the UK, their offices are owned in Bermuda by a company called Mapley Steps. It's quite incredible.
La compañía propietaria del contrato IFP para hacer funcionar la oficina central de HMRC pidió prestado dinero a inversores de paraísos fiscales a un interés del 15%. Como el interés era tan alto, la empresa perdía dinero y por ello no pagaba impuestos. En 2011, HMRC no pudo probar que ninguna empresa de PFI estuviera pagando impuestos en el Reino Unido.
I think we need to have a serious conversation about the role of government in this whole debacle and how much our government has been penetrated by big banks and accountancy firms and ultimately in whose interest it operates. The reason we were protesting outside the Africa PPP conference is that we wanted to make sure that citizens back in Africa should hear about the fact that such policies have been a complete failure here in the UK. We know that these products are not being marketed to African countries in their own best interests. Their only motivation is to spread the reach of financial services into new markets. It's all being promoted in the interest of the City of London. What you're seeing is basically a second form of colonialisation. You've had initially occupation, resource extraction, and through that process, countries like Britain, which have had a large offshore empire, have developed significant networks, and now those networks are being used to promote and exploit financial services